Welcome back, my dear brother priests. Once again, we are very happy to have you with us. And without further ado, Father Connor.
The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Again he said, "There was once a man who had 2 sons, and the younger said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the property.' So he divided his estate between them. A few days later, the younger son turned the whole of his share into cash and left home for a distant country, where he squandered it in reckless living. He had spent it all when a severe famine fell upon that country, and he began to feel the pinch. So he went and attached himself to one of the local landowners, who sent him out to his farm to mind the pigs. He would have been glad to fill his belly with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. Then he came to his senses and said, 'How many of my father's paid servants have more food than they can eat, and here am I starving to death? I will set off and go to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against God and against you. I am no longer fit to be called your son. Treat me as one of your paid servants.' So he set out for his father's house. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, and his heart went out to him. He ran to meet him, flung his arms around him, and kissed him. And the son said, 'Father, I have sinned against God and against you. I am no longer fit to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, fetch a robe, my best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us have a feast to celebrate the day. For this son of mine was dead and has come back. He was lost and is found.' And the festivities began. Now the elder son was out on the farm, and on his way back, as he approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what it meant. The servant told him, 'Your brother has come home, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has him back safe and sound.' But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and pleaded with him, but he retorted, 'I know how I have slaved for you all these years. I never once disobeyed your orders, and you never gave me so much as a kid for a feast with my friends. But now that this son of yours turns up, after running through your money with his women, you kill the fatted calf for him.' 'My boy,' said the father, 'you were always with me, and everything I have is yours. How could we keep celebrating this happy day? Your brother here was dead and has come back to life, was lost and is found.'" The Gospel of the Lord. My dear brothers, the prodigal son got off the track, as we know so well, and you and I get off the track from time to time, and we know it so very well, and the Lord always welcomes him back, but welcomes us back. The prodigal son, I think, is a very, very fine gospel for us to think about today as we meditate on the whole question of our human fallibility, temptation, and sin. Pope Benedict sets the stage for our meditation very well when he writes this. Every day, Christians must face a struggle like the one Christ underwent in the desert of Judea. It is a spiritual battle waged against sin and finally against Satan. It is a struggle that demands the whole of the person and demands attentive and constant watchfulness. The Christian life is a never-ending combat in which the weapons of prayer, fasting, and penance are used. Dying to oneself to live in God is the ascetic journey that every disciple of Jesus is called to make. With humility and with patience, with generosity and with perseverance. So the Holy Father has set the stage for us, my dear brothers, very, very well. This whole question of temptation and sin and struggle and all the rest. Archbishop Fulton Sheen, when he was a young priest studying at the University of Louvain in Belgium, had many occasions to visit the city of Paris. And he used to love to tell the story. And some of you priests, if you've listened to his retreat tapes, may very well have heard the story before. But he was, on one particular occasion, staying in a small hotel in Paris. It was very near the Opera Comique. And he went into the hotel dining room one evening to have his dinner, and there was a gentleman there playing the piano, and playing it very, very well. And when the man finished playing, the young Father Sheen went over and asked him if he would take dinner with him. And the gentleman said, well, I don't know. I've never talked to a priest in my life. Oh, he said, we're just like anybody else. You stick me with a pen, I'll jump too. So over he came to have a bite of dinner with Father Sheen. And the man started conversing. He said, you see that table over there by the window? Just about a year ago, I was in here and I saw a young lady having a little difficulty breaking a lump of sugar into her cup of coffee. So I went over to help her. And I sat down and she started telling me all of her troubles with her husband. I said, why not come live with me? And we've been together ever since. He said, I keep all of them about a year or so and then I get tired of them. Well, this one, he was on the verge of getting rid of as well. And one morning he came out and he found a little note on the kitchen table of the place where they were both living. And the note was written by the young lady. She said, my dearest love, if you do not stay with me to celebrate the first anniversary of our living together, I shall commit suicide by throwing myself into the river Seine. And then the gentleman said to the young Father Sheen, now may I bring her back to live with me so that she will not commit suicide? Sheen said, no, you may not. You may not do evil so that good will come of it. And secondly, she's not going to commit suicide. So the dinner table conversation went on. The dinner was concluded, and at the end of the dinner, Sheen said, well, I was very happy to speak with you. I'm now going up to the hill of Montmartre. Would you like to come with me? And this gentleman said, I was just beginning to think you were a good man. Now you're telling me you're going to go up to that hellhole of Paris. And Sheen said, well, there's an awful lot more on the hill of Montmartre than dives and dens. There is a great basilica of the Sacred Heart on the top of the hill. I intend to stay there all night in adoration. You may come with me if you choose. And as Bishop Sheen related the story, the man came. He sat next to him all evening. According to Fulton Sheen, there could almost be nearly approaching 1,000 men at adoration. And back in the early 1920s, those figures wouldn't be all that surprising. In any event, the sun came up the next morning. He said Mass. The two of them walked down the hill together. And he said, Father Sheen said, would you join me for dinner tonight? We can keep up the conversation. Yes. So Sheen arrived at the hotel dining room at such and such an hour, and there was this same gentleman with his newest female conquest. And Sheen said to him, now you've got to make a choice. It's either have dinner with me or go with her. Not both ways. So he said, the man started pacing up and down and up and down. And he came back to Father Sheen finally, and he said, well, Father, I think I would rather go with her. The moral of that story that Bishop Sheen used to tell really ties in very well with temptation and ultimately giving in to the temptation and committing sin. Here was a man, according to Sheen, who denied every grace that the good Lord was pouring on him at that moment. And one can only hope that he may have come back before the end of his days. But the question that Fulton Sheen raised, and I will be following a number of his thoughts, fathers, this afternoon on the topic of temptation and sin. He asked the question, well, why did that man act the way he did? Why were his preferences so much more inclined to the flesh than the spirit? This was a subject Bishop Sheen would discuss very often in the course of his career. And he would always begin, of course, by drawing the distinction between temptation and sin, the giving in to the temptation, the commission of the sin, as opposed to the saying no to the temptation. And he traced all of this to the complexity that is found in all of our human natures. Now, we're all flesh and blood men, and we have all felt these kind of temptations. The complexity of human nature is due to the fact that human beings are not one entity. Rather, we are a duality of body and soul, matter and spirit. And Bishop Sheen thought that an example from Greece and Rome might be a very, very good one to use. And this is what he wrote. The human personality is like the driver of a chariot, as Plato suggested. Before him are two headstrong steeds. One is the animal urge within us, and the other is the spirit. The charioteer or the driver has great difficulty to try to get both steeds headed in the same direction. The greatest of Greek dramatists, Sophocles, wrote of the great primeval disharmony. And Sophocles said that it was grave with age and infected all men. It was grave with age and infected all men. Ovid, the Latin poet, said, I see and approve the better things of life, but the worst things of life I follow. Ovid was really anticipating St. Paul there in many, many ways when he said that. And Bishop Sheen makes the point for you and I today that there's absolutely no one in the world who is not tempted. Temptations may vary from one person to the next in degree and intensity, and they may even vary with age. You may remember, if you read any of his works, he talked about the three ages of life. He said the sin of youthfulness is lust. The sin of middle age is pride, and the sin of old age is greed or avarice. Human nature, all of our human natures, of course, have tremendous inclination toward good. Sometimes that is not stressed nearly as much as it ought to be stressed. But we certainly have inclinations toward evil and corruption. Bishop Sheen writes, it is like a man who is down the well of his own stupidity. He knows that he ought not to be down there, but he cannot get out by himself. And we perhaps have all had the feeling. Well, that was a fine descriptive language for the secular world. But a spiritual answer has to be given to complete its meaning, and that spiritual answer was obviously found in the first act of disobedience in the Garden of Eden by the first man and woman who occupied this world. But Sheen also reminds his readers of an earlier act of disobedience committed not by we human beings, but rather by angelic spirits. He said, when an angel decides anything, it sees all of the consequences of its actions with complete clarity. Therefore, when we talk about the fall of the angels, they saw all of the effects of their decisions, and that is why their act of rebellion, their sin, can never be forgiven. But with human beings, it's very, very different. We often do not see all of the consequences of our sins, all the ill effects that flow from our personal sins. Hence, the mercy and the pardon of God is always, always at our disposal. Many, many decades ago, Bishop Sheen wrote, we have to conclude that God certainly did not create us fallen. There is a voice inside of our moral consciousness telling us our immoral and unmoral acts are abnormal. God made us one way, and we've made ourselves, in virtue of our freedom, another way. He wrote the drama. We changed the plot. We are not just animals who fail to evolve into humans. We are humans who have rebelled against the divine. Even we human priests know that feeling of inner rebellion against the divine. We are not depraved criminals. We are merely weak. We're not just a mass of corruption, for we bear within ourselves the image of God. We bear within ourselves a configuration of Christ, a unique one. We are sick. We need healing. We need deliverance. We need liberation. We know we cannot give liberation and freedom to ourselves. And then he goes on to talk about the natural concupiscence that all of us know within us, within our interior. Sin looks extraordinarily good to us. It looks so tremendously attractive. Each one of us has the power to regulate things outside of us. An example Bishop Sheen used is a screeching cat outside your window that's keeping you awake at midnight. So what do? You open the window, you take an old shoe and you throw it at the cat. It shuts the cat right up. So we can indeed regulate things outside, but what many people fail to realize, he writes, what many of us as priests fail to realize, is that we have the power to regulate things inside of us as well. Many things happen to us, Bishop Sheen writes, but what is more important is what we make happen to ourselves. He admitted a common objection that he often heard that would be raised quite frequently. Well, since God knows beforehand that I'm going to be a thief, that I'm going to be a murderer, that I'm going to be an adulterer, or whatever sin may happen to be mine, it seems almost foolish that he would create me in the first place. The answer that you and I give to penitence, the answer we would have to give to ourselves in our own life is we make ourselves the murderer and the thief and the adulterer. God knows very well what will be the final product, but he does not interfere with the exercise of our free will. As I think I said in a conference or so back, it is extraordinary to meditate on what he has done for us in free will. Listen to this one, good brothers, if you will. He wrote this in Peace of Soul, I believe it was. At the end of the day, the businessman will pull out of his cash register all the debits and credits of the day. So at the end of every human life, there will be pulled out of our self-conscious or unconscious mind the record of every thought, word, and deed. And this will be the basis of our judgment. That's enough to scare you to death when you meditate on that one for a while. Every thought, word, and deed. We human beings do indeed have consciences, but so very often we fail to heed their warnings. The voice of our conscience can very well be speaking to us, but we sometimes live and act as though the opposite were true. St. Augustine was very correct then when he said that whatever we are, we most certainly are not what we are meant to be. And if any one of us priests ever thought we were what we were meant to be at a stage in our life, we're probably the most pitiable of priestly creatures. We know it's always the struggle, always fighting the battle. Each person, each one of us, Bishop Sheen tells us, is profoundly the way he is. Not because of his parents, not because of his grandparents, not because of his great-grandparents, but rather because of his first parents. They were the ones who messed it up. And it was the second Adam who had to come into this world and rectify what the first Adam had done wrong. Men have been making themselves minor deities for the longest time, and it's something that we priestly men can fall into. In 1936, Bishop Sheen wrote a book. He was only, he would have been Monsignor Sheen in 1936. He wrote a book called The Prodigal World. What's interesting about this little excerpt from The Prodigal World is to think about the world of 1936. Men are no longer objecting to the church because of the way they think, but because of the way they live. They no longer have difficulty with her creed, but with her commandments. They remain outside her saving waters, not because they cannot accept the doctrine of three persons and one God, but because they cannot accept the moral of two persons in one flesh. Not because infallibility is too complex, but because avoidance of birth control is too hard. Not because the Eucharist is too sublime, but because penance is too exacting. Briefly, the heresy of our day is not the heresy of thought, it is the heresy of action. Interesting, isn't it? 1936, here we are in 2020, all these years later, yet we can see the commonalities in the human nature of the society around us. We can see the commonalities in the people with whom we minister to, in the people whom we are charged with instructing, and so on and so forth. Yet there's a very bright side. When a person is tempted to evil, Fulton Sheen writes, he must not think that there's anything abnormal about him. A person is tempted not because he's intrinsically evil, but because he is a fallen man. No individual has a monopoly on temptation. Everybody is tempted. Saints do not find it easy to be saints, and devils are not happy about being devils. No one can understand human nature, and no one can treat it adequately who thinks that a conflict is exclusively individual, or who thinks that the basic conflict within us can be healed by human nature itself. We try to heal it ourselves, brothers. You know, and I, from our own lives, we fall flat on our face. We just can't do it. There is a widespread belief, and probably one that we can even fall into ourselves, that man has it within himself to cure his maladies simply by trying to explain them away in our own mind. The inner conflict resulting from original sin is very, very deep-seated in all of us. That's what causes the conflict that goes on within all of us all the time. And disciplines like psychology treat very well the surface. But one has to go beneath and below the surface. We began with the gospel of the prodigal son. And it's very interesting what Bishop Sheen writes about that gospel we just heard. He's talking about the son returning. He said there is no record, there is not even a hint that he attempted to excuse himself or to extenuate his prodigality. He offered no theory about sin. He did not say that it was a fall in the evolutionary process. He did not blame his environment or his wicked companions. He did not tell his father that he had inherited a queer Freudian complex from him. He did not say that moral decline is only a myth and that sin is just an illusion. He did not say that men could no longer live according to traditional morality and must therefore have a new moral to suit immoral ways of living. He did not excuse himself by saying that a man was justified in sowing his wild oats and then forgetting, living for the present and having no responsibility for the past. There was none of these things in the mouth of the prodigal, and much less was there any such thought in his heart. And that is why St. Luke so beautifully recounts that story for us. In our battle with temptation, fathers, Bishop Sheen spoke often of the temptations that our Lord endured. When he wrote The Eternal Galilean, back about 1934, as I recall, he said, by permitting the prince of darkness to tempt him, even though it was wholly exterior and did not touch his sinless soul, he proved that he is not insensible to our difficulties, our sorrows, and our temptations. Sheen described our Lord's three major temptations as shortcuts from the cross. They were the negative preparation for his public life, just as his baptism by John the Baptist in the River Jordan had been the positive preparation. But he opened himself, this kenosis of our Lord involved so many things. And there is one of the beautiful examples of his opening himself to temptation. Where you and I often go wrong in our priestly lives would be in the very same areas where our Catholic laity, or anyone else for that matter, can go wrong in their lives. And that would be in the area of what we have always called in the church the 7 capital sins. Or as Bishop Sheen referred to them, the 7 pallbearers of the soul. We all know them so very well. And they are the areas where most of mankind's, most of humanity's temptations are presented and where most sins are committed. Pride, avarice, envy, lust, all the rest of them. We know them so very, very well. Bishop Sheen, would often use practical examples from his vast priestly experience. And one that he used, which I think is very, very worth remembering here. He was in the early 1970s over in Dublin, Ireland. He was preaching a novena in honor of St. Therese of Lisieux at what is called the Whitefriars Church in Dublin. It's a very, very famous Carmelite church. Those of you who know Ireland and know Dublin, they very well have visited there. And he talks about a story which Therese related herself. Seems one night she was in bed and she had a dream. And in this dream, she saw the garden of the monastery in front of her. And in the midst of the garden, there was a large barrel. And as she started looking at the barrel, 2 little devils started poking their heads out of the barrel. And Therese moved closer and closer. And finally, they went down inside the barrel. And when she went all the way over to the barrel and looked into it herself, the 2 little devils jumped out and they ran over to the convent and they propped themselves right at the laundry window on the 1st floor. And then her dream went on and she started walking toward them in the direction of the monastery. And the closer she got to them, this is in her dream, the closer she got to those 2 little devils, the further and further away they went. They were fearful of her because she was holy. In her autobiography, The Story of the Soul, she writes, on each fresh occasion of combat, when the devil desires to challenge me, I conduct myself valiantly, knowing that to fight a duel is an unworthy act. I turn my back on the adversary without ever even looking at him in the face. Then I am ready to run to Jesus and tell him I am ready to shed every drop of blood in testimony of my belief that there is a heaven. She makes it sound very easy, but temptations, as we know, can be very, very difficult. The point being that Fulton Sheen wants to make, we need never fall victim to the allurements of the adversary, There are tremendous resources available, fathers, for all of us, not the least of which would be recourse to a great saint like Therese. Another example that he would use very often in his sermons, which I think gets this point across, is this. He said, picture yourself in a large symphonic auditorium listening to a magnificent composition. Conductor composing this large philharmonic orchestra and conducting. And right in the midst of the composition, one particular musician strikes a discordant note. Now, it is possible at that point that the conductor can just stop the whole thing and start over again, but very likely he would not. Rather, the discordant note would go out into time and space. God knows how quickly it would be traveling. But man could not stop this discordant note in time and space. Why? Because as Sheen writes, time is irreversible and man is localized in space. The only way that this situation could be remedied would be if somebody were to write an entirely new symphony and take that discordant note, if you will, and make it the first note of a new composition. And that, said Bishop Sheen, is exactly what God did in reestablishing harmony in the universe. It had its beginnings at the Annunciation, when the angel Gabriel asked Mary, Our Lady, if she would give God a human nature. It continued in the Incarnation, and it was completed in the Paschal Mystery. This, then, he writes, becomes the first note in the new creation, the beginning of the new symphony, which will be played again and again by the divine conductor. How are other notes added to the new symphony? How are they added? We're the other notes, you and I. If, like Mary, our Blessed Mother, we freely consent to be added to this first new note. We become added by the sacrament of baptism, by which each person dies to the old Adam and is incorporated into the new Adam. These notes added to the first note constitute the new body of Christ, or what is known as his mystical body, the church. This is what it means to be a Christian. And we priests are at the forefront of Christianity. Sheen had known many persons in his life who would fall into the categories that he's describing abstractly or theoretically to us. One story that would come to mind would be the story of Haywood Broome. Now, some of you fellows may remember very well, if like myself, you've celebrated your 39th birthday already, you might remember Haywood Hale Broome. Haywood Hale Broome was a sports announcer on CBS for many years. Well, this is his father before him, Haywood Broome, and you might remember hearing of the Algonquin Wits, the famous Algonquin hotel on West 44th Street in Manhattan. And these literary types, well, let's see, Dorothy Parker would be one of them. And, you know, if I were thinking enough ahead, I would have looked up the other names before I came this afternoon, but I didn't do that. And you fellows will excuse me for not doing it. I'm actually not old enough to remember the Algonquin Wits. I just remember reading about them. Well, Haywood Broome was one of them. And he was a very close friend of Fulton Ausler, who was the great convert and the great writer of the 1950s. He and his daughter, April Ausler Armstrong. And Ausler suggested that because of the state that Haywood Broome is in, he might go and talk to Fulton Sheen. And he went and talked to him, and he said there were two things that I was very concerned about. One was that I did not want to die in my sins, and number two is I wanted to find out the truth. And so Sheen began to instruct him in the truth and heard his confession, and he did not die in his sins. Broome, incidentally, was the first person Cardinal Spellman ever baptized after he became Archbishop of New York. And to show you a little bit of media trickery, the day after Haywood Broome's funeral, there was a caption in one of the New York City newspapers. Monsignor Sheen reveals the secrets of the confessional. Well, of course, he did nothing of the sort. What he said in the eulogy at Broome's funeral was precisely what Haywood Broome had told him about why he was searching and searching for the truth and why he did not want to die in his sins. One time Sheen was at Lourdes and he was being followed by a young woman, and he had gone down to the grotto one night to say goodbye to Our Lady, and he was walking back up to the hotel to get his luggage and get the train, and all of a sudden he felt that someone was following him. He went further and further, and he walked back into the hotel, started going up the steps to his room, still following. He turned around and he saw a young lady. He said, "Are you following me?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" She said, "I don't know. I simply saw you in procession this afternoon and decided to follow you." And so he said, because of that encounter, I stayed in Lourdes 2 or 3 more days. Oh, he was at the grotto saying goodbye to Our Lady. Do you know what prayer he made? He said, "Blessed Mother, send me some kind of a sacrifice to save a soul." Because he used to say, if you think prayers aren't answered, try making that one sometime. Well, he said to her, "I think you're the sacrifice I have to make." He stayed there 2 or 3 more days. And he had terrible, terrible problems getting back ultimately to the University of Louvain in Belgium. But that was the price he paid to bring his soul back. Interestingly, she had been on a bus filled with tourists who were making a pilgrimage to Lourdes. They had come down from Holland, and they were continuing on through the Pyrenees after they left Lourdes. They found out a couple of days later, the bus had overturned. I honestly don't know how many there were, but there were, I don't know that it was a full bus. But everyone on the bus was killed in that accident. This would be in the 1920s. Somehow that girl was called to get off and stay off at Lourdes and not get back on the bus. Hence Sheen's point with all of these individuals is the fact that temptation and that battle can be won. Sins can be overcome. You and I can become very, very free. And to close, brothers, there are a few wonderful references that we have. You all know Gerhard, Cardinal Müller. He writes, "A person who has known Christ, who has truly embraced him, changes his habits, his relationships, his entire way of dealing with all of reality." That's a big jump. But my heavens, we can all do it in our priestly lives. Robert Cardinal Sarah, another magnificent gift to the church. Genuine liberty is a conquest, a concrete struggle that demands overcoming oneself by discipline and by effort. It requires, first of all, self-mastery and the discernment of one's own weaknesses and qualities. Liberty is the flame that lights up. It is the opposite of a blind feeling that draws us toward our abysmal passions. These are some magnificent thoughts, fathers, I believe, given to us by magnificent men. Bishop Sheen concludes, we can be tempted in 2 directions. One way, if cooperated with, leads to sin, and the other, if cooperated with, leads to God. But one thought is overriding as he concludes. He writes, the 2 great dramas of our life are the soul in pursuit of God and God in pursuit of the soul. The first, soul in pursuit of God, has less apparent urgency, because the soul that pursues God can do it leisurely, as Peter followed the Savior from afar. But when God pursues the soul, he proves a relentless lover who will never leave the soul alone until he has won it or been conclusively denied. Fathers, there is none of us anywhere who would come on a retreat because we're interested in denying him. But every single one of us, no matter how holy or unholy we are in our priestly life, no matter how faithful or unfaithful we have been, we are all daily in need of continuous, ongoing conversion so that we can become the men we truly want to become. And that is the topic that will occupy us in tomorrow's meditation. And old man that I am, I forgot to bring with me my relic of St. John Vianney, so we'll just bless all of you good retreatants. Benedictio Dei omnipotentus Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, descendat super vos et mani et semper. Amen. God bless you, brothers, and we'll see you tomorrow as we consider and meditate on the topic of conversion.
Thank you, Charlie, very, very much. Have a good evening, everyone. We will be gathering once again at 9:30 tomorrow morning for the morning conference. The waiting room will be open at around 9:20, and we'll begin to allow you to come in at that time. So have a wonderful evening, and God bless you.